Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to dive into one of the most essential skills for a web developer, and that is fetching data from an API. And in this video we are going to focus on using the Axios library. So whether you are building a weather application, a movie database, or just some cool JSON data, this video will walk you through everything you need to know, and it's going to be a step-by-step approach. So what are you waiting for? Let's get started.
Behind the scene, I have created a React application, and the name of it is called Fetch Data Fetching, and I have opened it by my left hand side in my Visual Studio Code editor, and on my right hand side is my browser. So I just set the browser and the Visual Studio Code side by side. So I've done a few cleanup to the app.js file here. So what we have here is just a simple React and the import of app.css file. Now, since this video is going to focus mostly on the functionality of this application, so we are not going to focus on the CSS part of it, the styling part of it. So what I've done is that I've created a GitHub gist where I'm going to drop the link of it that contains this app.css file. So it's all here. So since today's video is not about the styling, we are not going to talk about it. So let me just close. Though we are going to be making reference to it. So let's close it for now. Then let us go to our integrated terminal and see what we have on the screen at the moment. So when you open the terminal window by pressing Ctrl button and the key just below your escape key on your keyboard, you can go to the terminal and now run the command npm run dev. So once you hit the enter key, it is going to open our development server. So let's see what we are going to have. We are going to open this link in our browser. So let's copy it and go to the address bar of our edge and paste it there, and then hit your button, your enter key. So let's see what we have on the screen. Now, we don't have anything. Let's go to our app.jsx file and see why we are not having anything, because we have the word users list. So let me remove it. So let me say app, the word app. So here is app. So the app is on the screen. So if I just add another text to it, let's see whether it's going to render on the screen as well. Yes, of course, our app.js file, our application is running smoothly at the moment. So let us now go to our source folder and create a file. But before we do that, we are going to install Axios because our focus is on Axios. So let's go back to our integrated terminal and press the plus, click on the plus icon there so that we can open another integrated terminal window interface. Now, in this interface now, let me remove this one so that we can have a better working environment. So let us install Axios by running the command npm install Axios, just like that. Then hit your enter key. Once you hit the enter key, it's going to install it. So while the installation is currently going on, I want to go to my file explorer site and the root from inside the source folder, the src folder. I'm going to create a new file called users list.jsx. So it will have a JSX extension. Now, for this users list, let us import it into our app.jsx. So we now have users list, and let me make it an importation users list, then hit it like this, import it at the top of our component by typing import. So why is our this thing not working? Why is our automatic importation not working? Because within this users list we have not done anything. So let us just spin up a functional component snippet here by typing RESTful and hit your enter key. You can then remove the first line, it's not that necessary again. Then go back to our app.css and then click here, then control space. So we can now import it from at the top automatically now. So what we're having on the screen now, this users list now is coming from this file, users list, or you can say, okay, let's see whether it is actually coming from this side. Users list is running. So let's see whether it's going to render this word on the screen. Of course, users list is running. So we can now remove it now. All right, our installation of this thing of the Axios has been completed. So we can then go to the terminal and close this terminal window. Now for this application, we are going to have 3 state variables. The first state is going to be coming from use state, and with the structure, that means we are destructuring from use state, and the first state is the users, that means a list of users. Then we are going to set up a function set users that will change that the value of the user. So use state, and we are setting it to an empty array at the moment. Now the use state is not also important, so let's import it at the top of our component by clicking this link. Now it has been imported. So the second state variable we need here is the loading state. So we also destructure the loading state and set loading. They are all coming from the use state hook, and at the beginning the loading will be true. Let's set it to true at the beginning. Then the final or the last one is the error state. So assuming there's an error during the version of the data from the online server, we don't want our application to crash. So what we do at the moment, now let me just zoom my Explorer, my editor. So we don't want our application to just break down like that. So we want to handle the errors very well. So let's say set error. So it is also going to come from use state, and at the moment, at the beginning there is no error, so we are going to set the value of that one to null. Then we will now call use effect. Why do we need the use effect? Use effect helps us to perform side effect in a React component, functional component. So let me just say use effect from the use effect from the React use effect hook. So let me call it here. Now we can just put these two things on one line and then remove this one. Now, so it is a function, so it's an arrow function. Then we want it to run just once at the beginning. So all right, now inside this use effect, we'll then create a function and call it fetch data. So the function is going to be an async function. Why? Because once you are fetching data from an internet, at least you are saying wait until data finish fetching, then you can proceed to do another thing. So we can call it, give it the keyword asynchronous function. So let me bring the async word keyword to the back of this and put it here. Then it's an arrow function. Now, inside this fetch data, now first of all, let us call this so that I don't forget it. Let us call this function. We are now calling it now. Alright. Inside this fetch data now, we need the try catch block so that we can gracefully handle errors if there's any error. Now in the try catch, before we go ahead in the try, let us first of all create a variable where we are going to fetch our data from. That is the URL resource where we're going to fetch our data from. So it is what? HTTPS this is the JSON placeholder type code.com/users. Alright. Now let's assign it to a variable called URL. Alright. I think that is okay for now. So let's go back to our try block now. In the try block, since we have the async keyword here, it will not give us the ability to use the await keyword. So that means we are waiting for what? What are we waiting for? We are waiting for Axios. And when we are waiting for Axios, now we're going to import Axios at the top of our application. Of course, it has been imported. So we are waiting for the Axios now. We will now call the get method on this Axios library that we imported. Now say .get. Now, what are we getting, and where are we getting that info? We are getting the user's data from this URL that we assigned to this link here. So call the get method and pass in this URL. So we now say assign everything to response, a variable name response. So that is it. Now, still within this try block, we now call the user, the set user. That means we want to, whatever thing we get from this place now, that has been stored inside this response now, we will now pass it as a variable, as a value to these users. Understand? Whatever thing you get from this response now, we'll pass it as a variable, as a value to this response, this user's this thing. So let's say set users, and we will now say it is going to be response dot data. That means the value of these users now becomes whatever thing we get from this website. Now, the next thing we'll do now is to set the loading. As I've already gotten the data we needed, we don't want it to load again. Remember, when it was loading, we have never gotten the data. So now that we have gotten the data, we want to now turn off the loading. So we want to turn off the loading by calling the set loading function. Set loading now becomes false. Alright. Now, in case of any error, in case there is an error, we'll now say go into the catch block and say, okay, if there is an error, we'll now call the set error function and say, okay, set error function, please handle this error very well by saying error.message. Now we also stop loading as well. So let me grab this line. Since there is an error, we are not loading. So we are done with our use effects. The next thing we'll do now is, just after the use effect, we will now render it based on the state, based on this the use state variable that we have. Now, if, let's call the if statement. If loading, that means if there's a loading, if loading is true, if loading is true, we will then return a div that will say, oh, there is a loading. That means to allow the user that, hold on, your application is currently fetching data from the internet. So if there is a loading, we now return a div. Now this div now will be a user list container. So that's where we are going to refer back to our app.css. Now I'm going to open this app.css side by side so that we can be making reference to it. So we need this user list container as a class name. So we'll now pass it as a class name to this our div. That is if there is a loading, if loading is set to true. So if loading is set to true, then we'll then have an h1 tag. The h1 tag will have a class name of title. That means this title here, have a class name of title. Then what do we have in that h1 class? We have users list. Now below the h1 tag, we will now have a div that will show the spinning spinner, something that is going to be spinning on the screen to show you that currently your application is currently being fetched from or your data is being fetched from the server or from the API. So we now have an empty div. It's going to be an empty div. So the class name for that empty div is spinner. So let's grab it and say div.spinner, just like that. Now if loading is true, we have this block of display to render on the screen. Now if error, that means if there's an error, then if there's an error, we also need all these things. We'll return something similar to this, but a little adjustment. Just grab it and drop them here. But in this case now, we'll have an error div instead of the spinner, because it's not going to spin again. That means it's an error. So let me remove the keyword spinner and write error there. But instead of having an empty div that time, we'll now display the word error, and now say we'll now call that error error message to be shown on the screen. Now call it inside the pair of curly braces and say error. I think that is it. So if loading is false, if there is no error, then at that point we need the data on our screen. So we'll now grab this part and copy it and paste it inside this, because we also need the div container too. Then we'll then have the h1 tag with title as well. Also need the title, and now say users list. Of course, this title we have already seen it before. This is the styling for the title. So then after this one, now we'll then have another div that will now say user header list. User list header. Let's look at where you have the user list header and grab this. Just grab this and say okay, div dot not wrapper. We need the header at the moment. The header. Now for the header, what we need then is a name and an email, because we are fetching both the name of the user and the email of the user. So we need a two-span element. The first one is going to be name, and the second one is going to be email. Now, both of them will have a class name. Both of them have a class name, but the first one will have a user dash name. So that means the user must have a name. Where do you have that class name? Here is it. Then the second one we have user.email. So it's also going to be like this. Class name that is a user dash email. So then after this header list, user list header container, we then have our UL tag, UL like this. Now within our UL, let us give our UL some styling as well. That means if we want to give our UL some styling name, that means the item will be in the list. So users list, we need the users list. Let's look for where we have user list. So you have user list and grab it and say class name, paste it there. Then we then go into the block, the JavaScript block of code here, and now say, okay, this is where the main thing is being done. Now we now map over the array of objects or sort of users here. So let's us grab these users now and go here and now say, okay, users will then map all the map function or the map method on it, and I say, okay, for each user, we are going to have a function. For each user, we are going to say there is going to be an li with user dash item. User item. Now, when you are mapping over an array, we need the key props. So we need key. What is the key prop going to give us? The key prop will be now user the ID. That means each of the users is going to be identified by a unique ID that differentiates him or her from the other user. Then inside this li tag, we need two span elements as we did here. We need two span elements. We need span. The first span is going to be, let me just see, times 2. The first span here will be the username, and the second one will be the user email. So the first one is going to be user.name, and the second one will be user.email. So for the first one, we will also have the user.email. Okay, we can just say let's grab this one from here instead of having it as it. Just grab it from here and place it here. We don't need it as there. Then we'll also grab this one from here and place it here. I think that is it. That's everything we need for at the moment. So let's close our CSS and head over to our browser and see what we have on the screen. And expand our browser. Is it? We have a name, all these names, and we have an email for each of the user. We have an email and a name, an email and a name, and an email, a name, and an email, a name, and an email. And that is how we can fetch data from an API using the Axios library.